Okay, as you can see, here are my dry ingredients. I have two kinds of flour, whole wheat and white, and I have salt. Okay, and by the way, be careful. Don't forget the salt. One time I did, it's 1 teaspoon per loaf. Now if you really think about that, it's hardly any salt at all. The bread was basically, it looked like everything, you couldn't eat it. Now what I'm doing is blending the two kinds of flours together and obviously mixing the salt. It's a whole lot easier to mix dry ingredients first. Okay, that's mixed. Now here is my oil, my sweetener, which is honey and blackstrap molasses, and water. That's all that's in here right now. So now I'm going to add my yeast. It's basically a level tablespoon per loaf. That's 2, 3, 4. And I add just a little bit more, maybe that much more, 5. Notice I sprinkled it on top. Okay. Now you can let this sit, but it's warm enough today and the yeast is rising and I've got a production going today. I'm going to make 16 to 20 loaves, so 4 at a time, so I'm going to go ahead and mix. Okay. Now you'll notice, if you can see in here, sometimes it gets pretty lumpy. We'll deal with that in a little bit. What I'm doing right now is making sure the sweetener that's on the bottom of my bowl is getting mixed in with the water and the oil. And as you can see, the yeast is starting to break down some. Go around the edges, get the yeast off that, tilt it a little bit. And you don't have to try to get it all, but you want to, why waste it? You want it in the bread, not left in the pan. Okay, if there are lumps, what you have to do is this. Just keep going around on the sides. And these little lumps are not a problem, but if you have big ones, you just have to keep doing this till you break them up. And you keep stirring. Now some people let the yeast actually begin to rise right here in this with the sweetener, and it'll start to bubble, and you don't want to let it go too long before it'll almost develop a froth. You don't want to let it go too long before you get it in with the dough. Now this is pretty good, you can see. Okay, it's mixed pretty well. So now I'm going to add it to the dough. Try to do it so you can see. And what I look at in the bottom of the pan is to make sure the bowl, I'm not losing any of the sweetener. Okay. After all, you want that in the bread, not left in the bowl and just washed away. Okay, so you can see we pretty much got everything out of here. Okay, now this is what you've got. So what you have to do here is try to get it so you can dump it out on the counter. Well, you can't dump this out now, so kind of go around and fold. Once you get a bunch of it mixed, you stir till you get kind of a slurry, and then you bring up more flour on the top and keep mixing. This is where I suppose a large blender would be nice, or with a dough hook, but I don't have one. Okay, try to get most of the flour incorporated. Notice I'm using a cutting board because I'm turning the bowl. There's no sense scratching the counter. Cutting board of size. Okay, I might even sprinkle a little flour on here because it looks a little soupy. Dump it out. Okay, still have some stuff in the bowl. What I'm going to do is I put some flour on top of it. I'm going to go around and with my fingers like this and loosen it up so it's not wasted. Okay. Now what I do is heat the bowl. I heat the bowl by running hot water in it and leaving it in it while I knead the bread. That way the bowl is warm. This is totally optional, and if you have a really thin bowl, it wouldn't probably be worth it. But since I have an old bowl here, okay, run the water almost to the top. This also allows for easy cleaning when I go ahead and take the water out and butter the bowl when I'm going to let the bread rise, because I let it rise in the same bowl. I try to minimize the number of dishes. This has been stirred. This has been stirred, all my ingredients. Now we're going to knead it. I can do this in approximately 10 minutes. It's 8:42 by 8:52, or even less. It'll be ready to go into a warm bowl, a buttered bowl, and rise for the first time. Now, notice I'm just kind of folding everything in, trying to get some of the lumpy flour. The other flour I can just push aside. I've got extra flour right here. When it starts to stick too much to my hands, don't go crazy with the flour. You want to only add what you need to. You're working with live yeast, and the ancient Egyptians, bread makers, also made beer. And they were sort of yeast farmers in that sense. And by the way, in ancient Egypt it was probably better to drink the beer than the water. Anyways, you can see it's almost starting to look like something. Okay. Now my wife always said that what I'm doing here is by kneading is activating the gluten. Well, I'm not sure what that means. I think you are. But I think mechanically what you're doing is you're forcing the water molecules to be small enough to be around every particle of flour. And of course the water molecules are also carrying the oil and the sweetener and the yeast. So you're getting them around the flour and mixed in. Now, you might say, when do I add flour? The dough tells me when it starts to stick to my hand. Now, there's various techniques of kneading. One is you push down and you fold, push down and fold. And notice I'm giving it kind of a quarter turn. Okay. Like I said, this process. Now, here's the problem for a person who's shorter. If you notice, I'm kind of just rocking forward. And so by rocking forward, I can put a fair amount of weight without straining my back. If you're shorter, I'm 6 feet, you might look for something that's a shorter stance so you can kind of just lean forward. Again, this is where a dough hook on a heavy-duty mixer would handle all of this for you. I've never used one, and I'd have to experiment to get the same consistency that I get now by doing it by hand. Sometimes you add a whole cup of flour. Of course, you can see some of the flour didn't get mixed in anyway, so I'm back to the original quantity. Okay, it's starting to slightly stick to my hands, so I'm just going to put a little bit on my hands. A little bit here, but not too much. Just roll it around enough. And then start again. And work that in. One of the ways you know that the dough has been kneaded enough, at least this is my technique. One is it begins to resist folding on itself like that. This is not resisting at all. And you can actually feel it kind of not wanting to join together. The other thing you can do this isn't ready, but I'll show you a test. You put just a little dab of flour and you push on it. Now notice that's coming back up pretty good, if you can see. Okay, do you see? I'm not pushing way down, but so this is closer, but it's still sticky. I don't like that. And it's not resisting folding back together, so I think it needs to be kneaded. It's 8:47. When do we start? 42? Oh, 52. I don't know if I need to go 5 more minutes, so thank you, Sandra, my cameraman this morning, camera person. Notice that the outside now is taking on a different color. You see how it, or different texture. See how it's looking? Now, of course, we've already done this test. It's doing that very well. What we want to do so this is going to take less than 10 minutes, but I've also kneaded an awful lot of loaves of bread in my day. Last school year, 2009, when the Haiti earthquake occurred, we came up with an idea of a fundraiser. One of the students, we made bread. Thought we'd raise $500 from donations at the church. First Sunday raised something like $1,200 with 24 loaves. We set the goal then for 5,000, added zeros to our thermometer, and in the next 5 weeks we met that goal. 240 loaves, $5,000, and all of it went to Haiti. Okay, I think this is ready to go into a bowl. And what I'm going to do now is clean the bowl. You don't need to watch this. I'm going to clean it, dry it, I'm going to butter it, and I'm going to put this in there. And what this has to do is double in size. And then we're ready to take it out and loaf it. Thank you. Okay, the bread has risen. As you can see, it's more than doubled in size. Actually, doubling in size is enough. So now I'm going to punch it down, weigh it, and then loaf it. So I punch it down like that, and then take it out of the bowl. And what I'm doing, I had coated the bowl with butter, but just to make sure it doesn't stick. Okay, now you knead it for maybe 30 or 40 seconds, and I'm not doing it too vigorously. What I'm trying to do is form a loaf like this, and now I'm going to cut it into 4 pieces, but I'm actually going to trim some off. And I use a little trick here on my scale. I measure out a little over 1 pound, a little less than 8 ounces, okay? And I'll tell you why I do that. Okay, and those two I guessed right. This, I think it's too big. That one's still a little too big. There, that's close enough. This is probably a little bit, this is right, okay. Put the scale aside. So I've got 4 pieces at 1.8 ounces, and this is how much I've got left over. This is fairly easy, this small piece, to divide into 4 equal pieces. So I roll it into a loaf, cut it in half, and then cut each one of these in half, and then add them. Now, why do you need to do that? You need to do that because you're not always sure how much flour you add during the process of kneading it. So this way, if you add a whole cup, it'll be more weight. If you don't add the whole cup, it'll be less. Sometimes you add even more than a cup. Okay, now we're gonna loaf. Each one of these is gonna make a loaf, okay? So what I do is put it out here, roughly in an oblong like this. Take my rolling pin, flour it each time, and now, not too hard, roll it out, and you can see the thickness. It's probably a little bit over 1/4 of an inch, and so forth. Now, I work my way around the edges because that's where there's some air bubbles, okay? Take my scraper, flip it over. Okay, now, if I see any air bubbles or anything, I go ahead. Now, what I do is start rolling it, and I pinch it down, roll it, pinch it down, roll it, pinch it down, and so forth. Now, then I pinch in the ends, push them in like this, squeeze them over, do the other end. Okay, now I pinch down the seam. Sometimes I do this twice, depending on how it looks. And now we roll it, we're shaping it here, so we want it to look like a loaf. Check the seam one more time, pinch it maybe one more time, you don't always have to do that. Okay, there's a loaf. Take the pan, it's a buttered pan, put it in, and there's a loaf. Okay, now I'll do the whole scene again, stop. Okay, 1.8 ounces plus the additional added. Make an oblong, take my rolling pin, flour it each time. Don't push too hard, you're kind of rolling it. By the way, if the bread sticks to the pin, just re-flour it. Okay. And you can see maybe 1/4 of an inch thick to a half to a third, maybe a little more. Okay, and I go around the edges to get rid of any air bubbles. Peel it up. I always throw the wider side away from me. Look over this for any air bubbles or anything. There aren't any, it looks good. Go ahead and roll, pinch down, roll, pinch down, roll, pinch down, so forth. Okay, now turn it around to the end. I push in the ends carefully and then pinch it together. Same with the other end. Pinch it together and then go ahead and pinch the seam. Sometimes you do it twice, you kind of look at it. Okay, now roll to get that seam looking good. Check the seam one more time and roll. Okay, here's your loaf. If there are any air bubbles, put it in the pan. If there are any air bubbles in the loaf that you see, you could use the edge of to pop them and then kind of smooth it over. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and do some more here. Do the other two. Notice I'm not putting a lot of flour on it because the dough doesn't stick to itself. You don't need to. If you've got it in the right condition to begin with. Put the wider end up there. Look it over, it looks good. Roll, pinch, roll, pinch, roll, pinch, pinch, so forth. Tuck the ends. And pinch the seams. And roll it. Sometimes you end up with a slight hump here. You have to see if you can work that out. Sometimes you have to squeeze the dough to fill that in so you get a nice looking loaf like that. Okay. Looks good. As you can see, we have 4 loaves rising. Here are 4 coming out of the oven. Most cases, when you take them out of the pan, they'll come right out. If they don't, okay, here's a trick my wife taught me. Don't try to use a spatula or something else to take them out right away. Let them cool in the pan. Won't hurt them at all. And they kind of shrink a little bit away. They harden up. And then if you do have to use the spatula, you won't do as much damage to the sides of the loaf. But as you can see, one of the tests for whether a loaf is done is to tap. Okay, on the bottom like that. And you can see these have come out pretty well. And so I shake them to make sure that they are loose on all 4 sides. I butter the pans. Okay, and that's it for these. These aren't ready to go in, so we're all done with that.